You are standing outside a door that nobody else will touch. Inside, an entire family is dying. You know this because you can smell it from the street. The smell is something you have learned to breathe through, something you have trained yourself not to think about. You adjust the mask. The long beak filled with herbs and spices that your predecessor told you would protect you. You have no idea if it works. Nobody does. You knock on the door anyway, because this is your job. And in medieval Europe, this job had a name: plague doctor. And almost nobody wanted it. To understand why anyone took this job at all, you have to understand what Europe looked like when the plague arrived. In 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors on board were dead or dying. Their bodies were covered in black swellings the size of eggs, oozing blood and pus, appearing first in the armpits and groin, then spreading. The port authorities ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. It was too late. Within months, it had a name that would echo through history for 7 centuries: the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, it killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. In 4 years, Europe lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its entire population. Entire villages were abandoned. Cities that had taken centuries to build emptied in months. Priests stopped giving last rites because there were too many bodies and not enough priests left alive to perform them. Mass graves were dug at the edges of cities and filled so quickly that bodies were stacked in layers without ceremony. There was a man in a bird mask walking toward the houses everyone else was running away from. That man was you. You did not choose this job the way a man in another century might choose a profession, because the trained physicians had already fled the cities. The calculation was simple: stay and almost certainly die. Leave and probably survive. Most of them left. What remained were the men willing to stay. Some had no medical training whatsoever. Some were simply desperate men who needed money badly enough to accept payment for a job that came with a near certain chance of dying. Because here is what nobody tells you about plague doctors in medieval Europe. Most of them died. Not all of them. Not immediately. But the mortality rate among plague doctors was severe enough that cities had difficulty finding replacements and had to offer increasingly extraordinary contracts to attract anyone willing to take the position. Some cities offered plague doctors immunity from prosecution for medical experiments performed on patients. Venice in 1348, the city hired a plague doctor named Giovanni de Ventura. He lasted less than 2 months before he too was dead. Now think about what it actually meant to do this job every single day. You wake before dawn. You dress in a costume that was designed not by doctors, but by a French physician named Charles Delorme in the early 17th century. The costume has a logic to it, even if the logic is based on theories that are entirely wrong. The long, waxed coat, covering you from neck to ankle, is meant to prevent the disease from touching your skin. And the mask, the part everyone remembers, is shaped like a bird's beak and filled with aromatic substances. Dried flowers, herbs, spices. Medieval medicine believed that disease was caused not by bacteria or viruses, but by bad air. The smell of plague seemed to confirm this theory. The air around plague victims smelled wrong. Fill the beak with good smells and you filter out the bad air. This theory was entirely incorrect. The plague was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by fleas living on rats. The beak did nothing to stop bacterial transmission. The waxed coat may have offered some protection against flea bites, which is probably the reason some plague doctors survived longer than others rather than any benefit from the aromatic herbs. You carried a long wooden staff, not for walking, but for touching patients without getting close enough to touch them with your hands. The staff was not a symbol of authority. It was a tool for maintaining distance from the thing that was killing everyone around you. You lanced the buboes, the swellings in the armpits and groin, and drained them. This probably helped slightly in some cases and made things significantly worse in others. You prescribed bloodletting. You prescribed herbal concoctions, specific diets, prayers, and in some cases burning aromatic substances in the sick room to purify the air. None of it meaningfully addressed the actual cause of the disease. You were not ineffective because you were careless or incompetent. You were ineffective because the knowledge required to treat this disease would not exist for another 5 centuries. You were doing everything medicine knew how to do. It was just that medicine did not know very much. Between patients, you kept records. This is perhaps the part of the plague doctor's role that history values most, because the records survive and tell us things the dying could not. Plague doctors were required by contract in many cities to document the spread of disease, to map which neighborhoods were affected, which streets, which households. The word quarantine itself comes from this period. From the Italian quarantina, meaning 40 days, you were not just a doctor. You were a data collector operating in the middle of a catastrophe. There is an account from a plague doctor in Avignon, France, during the height of the outbreak, describing his decision to stop keeping count of the dead in his district because the count had become meaningless. The numbers were too large. He writes that he began to think of the dead not as individuals, but as a phenomenon, like a flood or a fire. He writes this without self-pity, just observation. Outside in the streets while you worked, the city was changing in ways that would take centuries to fully understand. Serfs who survived found themselves suddenly valuable because labor was scarce. The feudal system that had defined European society for centuries began, slowly and unevenly, to crack. Some historians argue that when God allows half a continent to die in 4 years, the theological explanations become difficult to sustain. You did not think about any of this while you worked. You thought about the door in front of you, the smell behind it, the family inside, the beak filled with herbs you hoped were working, the next house on the street with a mark on the door meaning someone inside was sick. Plague doctors were not heroes in the way the word is used today. Most of them were men who needed the money. They were ordinary people doing an impossible job with tools that did not work in service of a theory that was entirely wrong during the worst mortality event in European history. And every morning they put on the mask and went back out. The beak did not protect them. The waxed coat helped a little. The wooden staff kept them inches farther from the thing that was killing everyone. The ledger preserved the numbers for people 5 centuries later to read and try to understand. And when their contract ended, if they lived long enough for their contract to end, some of them negotiated new ones, because the plague was not finished, and neither were they.